When shorts were short only concerns itself with what was actually a very narrow window in football history when teams wore, well, short shorts. The podcast will only cover football from 1954, when Umbro made their first England kit with shorter shorts, a design that was widespread within English football by the mid-50s, to 1992, when short shorts were all but finished as Umbro's baggy shorts for Tottenham's new kit ahead of the 91 FA Cup final quickly caught on. I'm Daniel Ruiz-Tyson. This is When Shorts Were Short. If the shorts weren't short, we don't talk about it. Euro 92 was a strange competition, the last major international football tournament played before the no-pass-back rule was introduced that summer. And to be honest, after some of the football scene in Sweden that year, that new and at the time controversial ruling couldn't come soon enough. Relying on my memory here, which may not be quite as reliable as it had long been, I recall Germany's opening match at Euro 92 against the former Soviet Union, now briefly called the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States. And the ultra-defensive CIS had a free kick just inside the German half in the second half, I think, which ended rather quickly with the ball being played back to their own keeper. It wasn't a vintage Euros. This was no Euro 84. It wasn't even a Euro 80. There was one great game, the semi-final between the Danes and the Dutch, who, in my opinion, were actually better and stronger than they had been in 88 when they'd won it. The rest of the competition, I think, was forgettable. England turned up having turned qualification into a surprisingly dramatic moment, given they'd controlled their qualifying group, also featuring Ireland and Poland from start to finish. Going into the tournament, Graham Taylor's side had only lost once in his 2-year reign, a home friendly to world champions Germany at the start of the 91-92 campaign. But this side, through a combination of international retirements and the, I think, inexplicable exclusion of some of the leading England players of the day, such as Waddle and Beardsley, plus injuries to the country's most outstanding talents in Gascoigne and Barnes, as well as late pullouts and a bizarre run of injuries to 3 or 4 specialist right-backs who missed Euro 92, was far removed from the England that had pushed the Germans all the way in that Turin semi-final 24 months earlier. 2 years after Italia 90, 29 years before Gareth Southgate steered his young team to the Euro 2020 final, what we were about to see unfold was the poorest England side in living memory in the worst Euros I've seen. My guest for this episode is Harry Harris, a seasoned watcher of the national team during his 4 decades writing for the London Evening News, the Daily Mail, the Daily Mirror, the Daily and Sunday Express, among others, as well as writing something like 80 football-related books. Speaking just a few days before Euro 2020 kicked off, Harry joined me in looking back at where it went so wrong for England, the injuries, the retirements, the exclusions, and the no little matter of the estrangement between the manager Graham Taylor and his captain and star player Gary Lineker. Lineker's form under Taylor had arguably matched his early England form during the years when Glenn Hoddle was in the England side. But by the spring of 92, with his fearsome pace perhaps no longer what it was, and with a young Alan Shearer on the rise, Lineker's place was not as secure as it had once been. This is Harry Harris and Euro 92. So, Harry, let's start with Graham Taylor taking the England job after Italia 90. He'd openly coveted the England job, and he'd got it on the back of an impressive decade's work at Watford and then his revival of Aston Villa. But his direct style of football was questioned throughout his managerial career. At the time, was he the right man to succeed Bobby Robson? And who, if any, were his rivals for the job?
Yeah, I think he was he was in the right place at the right time. His CV at club level was unparalleled, really. You know, he took a little club like Watford from fourth division to runners up in the old first division, and to the FA Cup final on such a small budget, and developed so many brilliant players there, including John Barnes. So, yeah, I don't think there were any rivals. I think there was no adverse criticism from myself and the media, leading any campaigns against his appointment. I just think there wasn't really anything out there to suggest there should have been anybody else. I think the media felt at one point, having failed so miserably in the Euros in '88, that Bobby Robson wasn't the right man at that time. We were all proved wrong by Bobby, and good luck to him. You know, everyone deserves another chance. He got it by the skin of his teeth. I think he probably got it. And, we all know what happened in the World Cup in 1990. But after that, Bobby Robson should really have stayed on. Prior to the World Cup, he'd already made a decision to go for a variety of reasons that we're probably all aware of. The FA, as usual, was scratching around trying to find a replacement. And I think Graham Taylor was up for the job, ready for the job. And it was a simple, seamless thing for the FA to appoint him.
We'll look at where England are in 1992 in a moment. First, let's just see where you are in your career at this point. You're still at the Mirror. I think you started at the Mail, did you, in terms of the national?
Well, Evening News, then the Mail. Yeah, I was chief football writer at the Mirror at this particular point in time. And the media, large sections of the media, had a very good relationship with Graham Taylor. I think he was a very approachable guy. His dad was a journalist. He understood journalists. He appreciated them, respected them. And I think we all got on very well.
How long had you been following the national team by this point?
My remit was to follow the national team and the leading club sides in Europe and at home. So, yes, I was there with England every single step of the way, every game, every training session, every press conference, every trip abroad, every time England manager went abroad looking at opposition, a small group of the chief football writers went with him. So really, at that point, the way the media worked, you almost felt part of the entourage, and it was a great advantage in many ways, but a lot of people felt that you were almost like a camp follower. You were too close to the England team. At that time, you travelled on the same plane. You went to the training sessions, you stood on the touchline and you could shout across to the players and have a chat to them when they came off for a drink of water. It was a completely different atmosphere and relationship that you have now. You could stop and have a chat with the carousel to pick up your luggage and might pick up a story or two, who knows. But the fact is, you had a more intimate relationship than I think the media do now in the digital age.
You mentioned a few minutes ago Euro 88. We know what happened at Euro 88, but you look at that squad that England took to Euro 88, and you had some players such as Barnes and Beardsley who were in the form of their club lives with Liverpool that year. And, Terry Butcher, I think, was the notable absence through injury for that tournament. But that England squad was a really, really strong squad, and it was just shocking what happened. Is that a fair assessment? Because it was arguably a better squad than Mexico 86.
Indeed. It was complete whitewash, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. And the capitulation against Russia at the end, it saw the end of Glenn Hoddle's international career, and it would probably have seen the end of any other international manager's career. And how Bobby Robson survived it, I don't know. I think the media were very much split about whether he should go or whether he should stay at that point. There were one or two very, very close to Bobby and clearly were backing him to stay. Those who were taking a more perspective view of things felt that really any international manager, the way they performed in '88 with the squad at its disposal, would not have continued.
We know what happened to Graham Taylor in terms of his treatment at the hands of some of the media post 92. As a boy, I remember going to England games at Wembley during Bobby Robson's reign, particularly around 83, 84, the failure to qualify for the 84 Euros, and the abuse the team were getting at Wembley from fans. But Bobby Robson I don't think I've seen a manager get a harder time in the media than Bobby Robson did during his time as England manager. Have I got that wrong? Because we remember Bobby Robson now rightly for the exceptional manager that he was and his achievements in club football and getting England to Italia 90, but he did have a rough ride as England manager for much of his 8 years.
Oh, there's no question about it. And a lot of it was justified, a lot of it wasn't. Clearly there were problems with Bobby. He was an endearing character, inspiring in many ways, but in other ways he was quite odd. He couldn't quite remember who was who and which player's name was applicable to what he was doing. So to many on the outside, he came across as a bit of a bumbling character and not really the right one for a manager to lead the national team. But there was something about him. I followed his Ipswich Town team throughout Europe at their peak and got to know Bobby very well. The Kobolds at Ipswich were very welcoming. Hospitality was great there. You'd go into the boardroom after a match, you see the chairman and Bobby, and you've got a good relationship with them. And you saw a lot more from the inside as a journalist in those days. And travelling with Ipswich, you could see the quality of football that they were playing, the quality of football he brought from Ipswich, the England team. In many ways, he was a perfect England manager. But when we got to Graham Taylor, as I'm sure you will eventually, we got into this point about the impossible job. And do I not like that? The documentary, people kind of perceived England as the impossible job. I don't think it was. But I think Graham Taylor turned it into it. To a degree, I think that came before him with Bobby Robson. There was certain aspects that were impossible for an England manager to cope with, as the media turned into a more personal attack rather than an analytical one on the way the game had been played or the manager had picked his team or the strategy that he used and the personnel at his disposal, selections of squads. That was one aspect of it, but then it turned very personal. And I think Bobby Robson suffered very badly at one stage. And it's admirable the way he came through it. And I think the reason he was so passionate about the England job. He was passionate about making England into a great team. And I've not seen that in many other England managers. I saw it more in Bobby Robson than anybody else.
So we come to where England are in 1992. Peter Shilton and Terry Butcher have retired. Brian Robson, after 3 caps under Graham Taylor, despite the work that's beginning to take shape at Old Trafford under Alex Ferguson, and Robson is still a critical part of that. Brian Robson has his England career brought to an end by Graham Taylor. David Platt had succeeded Robson in the England midfield, and he was getting the goals that Robson used to get in his pomp. Platt's about to move from Bari to Juventus, a good player, maybe not at the same level as Robson, but had Shilton, Butcher and Robson been adequately replaced in those first 2 years?
Well, it's like saying, was Gareth Bale adequately replaced when he left Spurs, and will Harry Kane be adequately replaced when he leaves Spurs, or Ronaldo when he left Manchester United? You're talking about 3 exceptionally gifted individuals, not just world-class performers, but leaders in the team, particularly Butcher and Brian Robson. You can't replace them, certainly not like for like. And that did have a big influence on what happened to Graham Taylor. And of course, probably as much so, perhaps even more, arguably, what happened to Gazza. Gazza came back from the World Cup, arguably one of our greatest ever players, possibly the greatest ever player, but still very young. And the progression with Gazza as a central point of the team, everyone thought, well, England would be a formidable force again. They could have easily won the World Cup in 1990. And what can they achieve going forward as he gets older, more experienced? What could England achieve with a Paul Gascoigne in their team? But of course, he crocked himself in the FA Cup final, and we spent months, nearly a year, trying to get him fit again. There were a number of factors which undermined Graham Taylor, I think.
If anyone is listening to this and maybe shaking their head at your saying Gascoigne might have been one of our greatest players ever, if not the greatest player ever, his form the year after Italia 90 before the injury was incredible. I mean, it's 30 years ago now, but he was reaching a level that if it hadn't been for the injury, you know, Diego Maradona's winding down his career, Roberto Baggio's emerging, there's Romario, but Gascoigne was in that bracket, wasn't he, going into the 90s? The 90s could well have belonged to him, the way he was playing.
Well, it was no surprise to me, and one or two others that followed England. And in fact, you mentioned the Daily Mail. I think I was on the Daily Mail at the time, and I went to the under-20 tournament in Toulon. And Gascoigne was there. And again, you know, he travelled with the team, we stayed with them in training and all that. You know, bump into Gazza coming out the lift or going into the lift with him. Yeah. But when you saw him play, even at that age, in an England shirt, not even in the senior level, what he was able to do, it was no surprise how he was progressing. And how he could have progressed is something which I think we all regret not seeing. Personally, I do. I saw him many times playing at club level at Spurs, and you just think, wow, this is something really different, exceptional. And I've seen all the great players, you know, Zidane, Gullit, who can play midfield, score goals as well. Talk about Brian Robson. I've seen Cruyff play. You know, he could have been as good as any of those.
There was still notable talent in the team. Des Walker had a brilliant Italia 90. He's now about to move to Sampdoria going into Euro 92. It's a move that will have a serious impact both on Forrest and Walker as the move to Italy doesn't quite work out. At this stage, was he England's most important centre-half?
Yeah, I mean, I speak to him quite regularly now. You know, he wasn't, for me, surprising that he went abroad. He's not the kind of character that would have warmed to that kind of situation. I don't know how he was convinced that it would be. He just had phenomenal speed and the recovery. And as a defender, again, you know, I haven't seen very many better defenders in world football in all my time in the game, particularly with that awareness and speed. So, yeah, I mean, I think you're talking about a lot of key players that conspired against Taylor. But having said that, you know, until he got into the tournament, he had a very good record with England.
Yeah, they'd gone into the Euros that summer with still, I think, only one defeat, which was to the unified Germany in a friendly. As you say, they were looking pretty solid. In goal, Chris Woods had to wait patiently to replace Peter Shilton as England's number one. Woods got the nod as England's number one ahead of David Seaman under Taylor. What was your view on Chris Woods as England's first choice? It's a position that he holds for 3 seasons.
You had some world-class goalkeepers, didn't you? Going from Gordon Banks to Ray Clements to Peter Shilton. Unfortunately, you know, it's not easy to maintain those kind of standards at the highest level with England. You know, it's okay if you're playing Albania, but, you know, if you're playing Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and you haven't got a world-class goalkeeper, you're at a huge disadvantage.
England are in the driving seat for almost all of their qualifying group. It's only 8 teams at Euro 92, so it's only the top sides that go through. They've drawn 1-1 home and away with Ireland, but Ireland, unlike England, had failed to beat Poland in Dublin. So England are in control right until that final game against Poland, and they're trailing 1-0. Gary Lineker grabs a late equaliser for them to make it to Euro 92. Was that maybe an early inkling that something wasn't quite right? Because it seemed to be a rather dramatic qualification when for most of it they'd been in control of the group.
I would say not, and I'll tell you why, because there's always a drama with England in qualifying for every World Cup or European Championships. There's always a drama when they start the tournament. They never start well. I wouldn't be surprised they don't start well in the Euros, just about to come up in a few days' time. It's always the case with England. There's always a big drama, then they scrape through, and suddenly they progress through a tournament. If they can progress through a tournament to the later stages, they suddenly get their act together. I think England teams are not great travellers. There's problems with it. They're bored. There's got to be some fun and games behind the scenes. There's got to be something to entertain them. Let's bring in some comedian or someone to make a speech or play table tennis. Or all the other countries get down to work. They train 3 times a day. You know, they're there to try and win a tournament. England seem to be progressively players are bored, as if they're on some kind of holiday, but without their partners or friends, and not many drinking sessions unless Brian Robson or Terry Butcher are around. But, there seems to be a complete different mentality with an England team than there is with some of the top European sides for me.
The draw for the Euros is held in January 92, and Graham Taylor gets his wish. He'd hoped to avoid Germany and the Dutch in the group stages. Scotland draw the short straw. They end up playing the Netherlands, Germany, and the CIS, formerly the Soviet Union. The draw, though, is kind to Taylor and England. It places them in what looked like the slightly easier group. At the time, they were going to be opening against Yugoslavia, and we'll come to that shortly. You've got the French appearing in their first international tournament since Mexico 86, and Michel Platini has rebuilt them, and there was a lot of interest in seeing what he might have done with that French team. And you've got Sweden. They weren't going to be easy to roll over. England didn't have a great record against Sweden. Sweden had topped the qualifying group going into Italia 90 that involved England, and Thomas Brolin, seen as something of a joke figure after his time at Leeds, but at this point in the early 90s, he's emerging as one of the world's top players. How did you see the draw for England? Were you thinking the semi-finals are a must?
Optimism runs riot, doesn't it, prior to a tournament in the media. So everyone is gung-ho, waving the flags, particularly the tabloid press one part of. And it's, England are going to win it easily against these foreigners who've got no idea how to play the game. There was nothing daunting about that group, was there? You weren't playing Argentina and Brazil, for goodness sake, And of course, I'm sure you're going to come to it, we never actually played Yugoslavia, and we ended up playing a team that were all on the piss, weren't they, and on the beach, having a nice whale of a time. No, it looked on paper to be quite an easy ride.
England, though, they'd had favourable Euro draws, and you'll know more about this than me. In 1980, they were expected to finish in the top two in a group containing hosts Italy, Spain and Belgium surprised everyone there. Euro 88, they were expected to fight out the top two spots with the Dutch. It didn't work out there. And you've talked just now about optimism, England fans being optimistic. I wonder, though, as a result of the unexpected run to the semi-finals at Italia 90, which should have probably been the final, given how they played against West Germany that night. Was there in addition to the optimism, was there a bit of complacency this time, given what England had just achieved 2 years earlier?
Probably. But I think that optimism is fueled by the media, particularly the tabloid press. And I hold my hands up and admit that's exactly what the media wanted to achieve. And although the media has changed and the attitudes have changed, it to me seems very similar now to what it was then. There's no real proper assessment of the opposition. There's no real assessment of the England team. We're coming up to a new Euros, and we've had a couple of friendlies, albeit resting key players. The other nations aren't resting key players. They're properly building up towards the tournament because they're given the time to do so. England is never, ever given the time to do so. I mean, we're always on the back foot at a disadvantage before we start. I mean, it's hopeless, really, that the way the game is run in England. It is just not really designed to enhance the England national team. Never was. The Premier League was actually formed with a promise to do exactly that, to help the England national team. It was a fob off. Once they got their foot in the door with the Premier League, that little small print about helping the England team and only having 18 or even 16 teams in the Premier League, everyone conveniently forgot that, and the FA were put to one side. So the Premier League aren't interested in the England team. The clubs aren't interested. One or two managers would be quite happy if their players didn't go at all. They're proud that they do, but they want to be fresh for next season. You know for sure one or two are going to pick up some nasty injuries. So it isn't geared up for international football in our country at all.
It's interesting you say that, because curiously in 91, researching for this episode with yourself, I remembered that the first division that season had reverted back to 22 teams. So for the 91-92 season. So the national team, every chance they're going to be playing an international tournament the following summer, and suddenly the first division's gone back up to 22 clubs, which was a very strange decision.
Well, particularly as I just referenced, why the Premier League was formed. But then, of course, once it's got up and running, no one wants to leave the Premier League. So all this nonsense about, playoffs at relegation and letting more teams being relegated, 3, 4, it all went out the window. It was a farce. And nothing's been rectified to change that situation since 1992 and the formation of the Premier League. I can't reiterate it enough, and people need to realise it. English football is not geared up to the international team. It doesn't care about the international team and would rather do without it.
Gary Lineker had succeeded Brian Robson as England captain under Graham Taylor and was in some of the best form of his England career in the first 18 months under the new manager. Going into the Euros, though, Lineker had been left out of the starting lineup for a couple of the friendlies. I think Shearer had come in for his debut at Wembley against France in February of 92. Lineker was also left out of the friendly in Czechoslovakia the following month. He's trying to get the goal that he needs to equal Bobby Charlton's international scoring record, and there's that failed penalty against Brazil at Wembley. The relationship between manager and captain at this point, it starts to come across as a bit strained. And there are a couple of quotes from Graham Taylor that I'll come to later in this episode. Do we know what was going on? Was there a problem between the manager and the captain going into the Euros?
Yeah, there was. There was a big problem because Gary Lineker had a great influence on the team, for obvious reasons. He progressed to the point where you would have such a big influence with his fantastic record and what he was achieving and had achieved. But, Graham Taylor actually was a very good manager. People lose sight of the fact, particularly at club level. And he could see that Gary Lineker was losing that half a yard of pace, picking up 1 or 2 injuries, wasn't as sharp as he had been peak of his career, possibly coming towards the end of his international career. And he had an absolute gem of a new striker coming through in Alan Shearer. Now, I don't think Graham Taylor felt that he could play the two of them together. They weren't compatible, although he did try it, and it didn't work. His preference was to bring in the younger player. Now, his problem was how to ease out the England captain and the record goal scorer, and that wasn't going to be easy. So he was phasing in Shearer, trying to phase out Lineker. And it was quite clear come the turn of the year that his preference would have been to go into the tournament with Shearer as his number 1 striker. That was not easy to achieve. And I think he should have actually made up his mind and done it. But Lineker also had a great presence with the media. He'd been around a long time. He'd saved England many times. He had an accord with the media. And he, rather than Taylor, had the media on his side. So it wasn't an easy situation. I think that was his most difficult situation. And I think that Gary Lineker could sense what was going on and wasn't happy about it and was making every effort behind the scenes to ensure it didn't happen.
Partly a situation, though, maybe of Taylor's own making in that he'd made him captain in 1990. I guess maybe that was because he hadn't foreseen the emergence of Shearer and he thought maybe Lineker might be in better shape going into 92. I mean, the move worked out. Lineker was in brilliant form for England in 1991, but there's certainly a slight tailing off in that following season. But a problem of Taylor's own making in that he gave Lineker that extra power by giving him the captaincy?
I think it was a difficult scenario for Taylor to make someone captain and then strip him of being a captain very shortly afterwards. It would smell of making a big error. And it would have caused a division in the camp. It would have caused a friction within the camp, which he didn't want to achieve. So it's a difficult balancing act. And that was one of his biggest problems. And I don't think he knew how to resolve it. And probably few managers would. It was a difficult scenario for him.
And Lineker's still only 31 at this time. He had 10 World Cup goals behind him. He'd scored 28 goals in 35 games for Spurs in that final Division 1 season, a campaign that had been interrupted by off-the-field issues with a serious illness of his first child. He was still formidable, but it's interesting that I think you were saying a few minutes ago that maybe not just at international level, but at club level, he was losing a bit of pace. Do you think he went to Japan at the right time? Because I always thought, well, he's only 31. It's a really strange move. Okay, there's the money he's going to get, but aside from the money, this guy's just got 28 goals. Why is he
Well,
going?
I went out to Nagoya with him actually on the flight out to Japan. Look, he had, and he kept it under wraps as much as he could, but he had an ongoing toe problem. And he knew it was time, that his time was limited at the top, and he took the option to go to Japan. And as you may recall, hardly played any games when he got there. So, no, it was, Alan Shearer was on the rise, and he was a formidable goal scorer. And it was his time, I think, at the turn of that year, for him to become England's #1 striker. And that was the difficulty that Taylor had in how to manage that, and he couldn't.
We'll come to the paucity of the 92 squad shortly, but first let's look at the injuries which laid waste to the squad. You'll have followed the national team probably for over 40 years, and you'll remember the injury dramas that tend to play out with England. Keegan Brooking in Spain, Robson 86 and 90, Beckham, Rooney. The 92 squad, I mean, the injuries just lay waste to that squad. It's incredible the amount of right backs they lose just prior to the tournament. We're going into Euro 2020 with 3 right backs, might have been 4, but the 92 squad couldn't actually get a right back in. They're going in, I think, they end up playing Keith Curle and David Batty at right back in their games. There was Gary Stevens was also injured. He was a very experienced fullback. I can't remember Paul Parker. I know that he'd been excellent at Italia 90. He'd moved to United and played well. I can't remember if he'd been excluded by Taylor or if he was injured going into Euro 92. But there was Rob Jones as well, had a breakthrough season, but was out with shin splints. Gary Charles hadn't quite kicked on from his England debut a year previously. So they're going into an international tournament without a specialist right back. Did you think, looking at the squad that summer, that was going to be an issue, or did you think they'd be able to get by?
Well, the first 2 matches, they drew 0-0. So 2 clean sheets, you wouldn't worry about too much about their defence. And in many ways, I just see the same errors over and over again. We're worrying about 4 right backs as we go into this new tournament. No, I don't think all the problems about right back in Graham Taylor's time was the issue. I think more of the issue is trying to find the right formula in going forward, creating, scoring goals, being on the front foot. That's what you need to do in tournaments. You need to be progressive. You need to be an exciting best team out there. You've got to play with a lot of courage and a lot of imagination and win the tournament. We never actually quite do that until really at the last minute, and then we hit a post or just can't get it, miss a penalty. It's all kind of like, for me, for England, it sort of just always comes too late.
8 days before England's opening game against Denmark, John Barnes had injured his Achilles in the friendly with Finland. That's an injury which effectively finishes his days as a winger stroke forward. He's been out for much of the season at Liverpool, as Gascoigne has at Spurs. So they weren't really, it would have been a real surprise had he been fit for Euro 92. Mark Wright drops out late on, and that, I think, causes a club v country row. And I think England then try to get Tony Adams in, but they can't. UEFA don't allow them to get Tony Adams in. And so they're going into, for some reason that year it was 20-man squads, but England are going in with a 19-man squad. Just a very strange situation. Do you remember why UEFA had overruled the inclusion of Tony Adams?
It's a long time ago, so no, I don't. But, I think we now have this force majeure. So if things like that happen again, you can bring players in. But why they didn't, I don't know. But, English football, the FA, have never been high on the Christmas card list of UEFA and FIFA for many, many reasons. And if there was any reason not to help the England team, they'd probably say, well, that's the rule at the time. We're not bending it for you guys.
Still to come on When Shorts Were Short.
I'm afraid he couldn't resist those digs because, with that half a yard of speed gone, Gary Lineker had become the player everyone criticised him in the first place, which is a bit unfair. He'd been a bit of a goal hanger. But, he had incredible speed and he was a formidable striker. But without that half yard of speed, he became less effective for the team.
There are injuries, but there's also quite a bit of talent that's just been left behind, been disregarded by Graham Taylor. There's the likes of Chris Waddle, who was outstanding at Italia 90. He's had 3 brilliant years in France. There's Peter Beardsley. Both of those players are going to light up the early years of the Premier League. There's Ian Wright, has had a brilliant debut season at Arsenal, and he's left behind. David Seaman, we mentioned earlier, doesn't travel. He's not part of the party. Paul Ince, now established as an outstanding midfielder at United, almost turning 25. I think he's 25 when he finally wins his first cap. And you have players like, decent club players, Andy Sinton, Carlton Palmer, Neil Webb at United, Ince's teammate, who Webb hadn't really been the same player since that, I think, injury against Sweden 3 years earlier. Who were the players for you that should have gone, that were fit, who should have been in that squad, and why do you think they weren't part of Graham Taylor's plans?
It sounds very strange when you read those names out, but I don't think at the time anyone was suggesting that he made any wrong choices. I don't think that, as far as I can recall, I don't think anyone was criticising him, players he left out, players he brought in. I think the guy has always struck me as fair-minded, and he would look at players that would fit into his team strategy. I don't think there was anything malicious or anything going on behind the scenes in particular, but he would have chosen the players that would have suited him and his style of play.
Can you remember what this particular period of English football was like in the late 80s, early 90s in terms of young talent coming through? I mean, we now hear that we've got all this outstanding young talent coming through the academies. We're seeing a lot of that talent now in the England team. Was there a bit of a drought in English football at this time in terms of emerging talent?
I just think English football still was very much in the dark ages, as far as the development through the junior teams and how they played, and the kind of like when they talk about the DNA and playing all the same way and coming through the ranks and developing the young talents as they do in their academies. These days, I don't think there was a much investment in the academies. I don't think the training facilities, even the top clubs, were as excellent as they are now, with a massive new investment that foreign owners have brought in. I'm not saying that foreign owners have been particularly, great for the game per se, but certain things, investment in the training facilities and the academies have improved immensely. And I think you do get greater emphasis on the young players coming through at club level and filtering through to the England team, that's for sure. But it wasn't without young players coming through, because Gascoigne was pretty young when he broke into the England team. But I remember many discussions with Bobby Robson, why don't you pick Paul Gascoigne? But there was a lack of trust in young players at that time. England managers went for established international players. Also, we had issues with the supporters. That was still prevalent behind the scenes. There was always problems whether the England team would be thrown out of a tournament because of the behaviour of the fans. And that all had a knock-on effect in the media, the perception of what was going on. And it did filter through to the England camp. There's no question about it. It had an adverse effect.
So, as mentioned earlier, 10 days before the tournament commences, Yugoslavia are thrown out. Denmark replaced them. And this wasn't quite the exciting mid-80s Sepp Piontek Denmark side. It wasn't that flamboyant side that wowed everybody in the summer of 86 in Mexico. This was a more pragmatic, less flaky incarnation of the Danes, less gifted than Yugoslavia. But retrospectively, with Taylor having prepped for the opener against Yugoslavia, how much of a problem was that for England?
I thought none. Really, I think the way England teams at that stage prepared for games, they did do their homework, no question about it. They knew what the opposition was like. They'd have quickly reassessed what Denmark was like, whether a bit of complacency would have crept in, considering, everyone was talking about Denmark being on the beach. But look, I go back to the Mexico World Cup, when our first game was against Portugal. The England team was staying up the mountain in Monterrey, and the Portuguese were 200 yards down the road. The Portuguese arrived for the tournament in dispute with their FA over World Cup bonuses and refused to train the entire week before the England match. And in the England camp, we were going, this is going to be a bit of a push. They're all sitting in their armchairs or sitting on sunbathing and have down tools and won't train. And of course, Portugal were brilliant in the opening game. We couldn't beat them. So, the only surprise is the tournaments always throw up a surprise. And for me, I think England are always ill-prepared for that.
Peter Schmeichel had just spent his first season at United going into Euro 92. And I do remember watching the games on the BBC and ITV, and the jury was still out on him, which really surprised me. But I think it was Euro 92 and particularly the semi-final, Denmark against Holland, possibly the best game of the tournament, that finally showed us just how exceptional a keeper Schmeichel was. You mentioned earlier that, England always starts slowly in tournaments. I wanted to ask you, this game finishes 0-0, and maybe the country expected more because of the Danes' late arrival. And maybe the result just left everyone feeling a bit flat. You'd been around the block with a national team. You'd seen this time and again. At this stage, were you worried?
No, it was par for the course. You wouldn't say worried, but, it was like you build it all up. England are going to be world beaters. They've got so many good players. And you talked about how many players came out, but even so, the quality of English football is at a certain level. And there's a lot of players at that level. We talk about Paul Gascoigne being exceptional, talking about Gordon Banks being exceptional, Peter Shilton and Brian Robson, Terry Butcher. There are exceptional players. Gary Lineker was a great goal scorer. Alan Shearer was a great goal scorer. But generally, they're all of the same level. And whether you've got 4 right backs all of the same level or 5 centre halves at the same level, you really need 3 or 4 standout world-class players if you're going to win a tournament. And England are always short of that. For me, despite how much you build them up, it's no surprise when it's a damp squib. And then all that happens is everyone, the media, the fans all turn on England because they expected so much more. So the first game is kind of like a benchmark. But for England, it shows up a number of issues. For me, it shows up the lack of preparation time, the lack of national pride and commitment to the England team in the way they're preparing, in so much as the way the season is calendar season is taking shape in other countries, given more time to prepare. And then when the players arrive, they are committed to winning the tournament or playing well in the tournament or enhancing themselves in their careers. Whereas the England players are always worried about the card school or who's going to win the darts tournament. And let's see some, inspirational figure coming in to amuse us. It's no surprise that England always starts slowly because they're so ill-prepared.
The game with Denmark finishes goalless. Is there an element now, right after the tournament, where England could say, well, hang on a sec, yes, it was 0-0 against Denmark, but they went on to win the tournament. So retrospectively, that was a decent result.
Got to clutch at some straws, I suppose.
The next game, France-England, another goalless draw in Malmo. There was trouble, I think, before the game between the fans. You mentioned that was a recurring issue with England games. Batty came in at right back for Keith Curle. It was one thing, this England team not being brilliant to watch, but it was a bit of a surprise that a French team managed by Michel Platini, part of that glorious 84 team, they weren't too easy on the eye as well, were they?
No, I think some of the best teams play their way into a tournament. They're not particularly bothered like England are. You build them up, they don't play so well in the first game or two, and then hell breaks loose. With the other countries, they actually know the best way to win a tournament is to build up your confidence in your strategy and your team play and your preparation in the early games. The key is not to lose. I didn't really was surprised by that. I think France would have thought holding England to a 0-0 would have been a good result for them.
One of the players whose form was outstanding under Graham Taylor for England was Stuart Pearce, like Gascoigne, another player who seemed to have gone up several levels after Italia 90. And he hits the French woodwork with one of his trademark free kicks. Then he's involved in an infamous incident with Basil Bowley, where I think he gets headbutted off the ball. The referee misses it. And that's maybe one of the more memorable incidents from a game I think that Barry Davies described in his autobiography as one of the most sterile defensive internationals he'd ever seen. So for the 4th consecutive international tournament, England have failed to win their first 2 games. Now, again, you're a veteran England watcher. You've seen this. You've seen them in many tournaments, and you've seen them get out of this Were you now starting to think, though, hang on a sec, I'm not sure these guys can get out of this. I'm not sure there's enough here to get out of this situation.
Well, going on past records and past experiences, no, you think they dig themselves in a hole, and they always seem to dig themselves out in the final qualifying game. And Gary Lineker has been the one often to achieve that. And no, he was playing his final international match. He'd cocked up badly with that penalty, hilariously so. And this was his last chance to equal Bobby Charlton's record. But unfortunately, there was a suspicion that the guy was past his sell-by date. And Alan Shearer was really the one that should have been out there in the centre of the attack. But with all the sentiment leaning towards Lineker, you could see why he started and was out to break or equal the record. And it was Sweden. It wasn't Brazil, no. It wasn't Argentina. It wasn't a dire Italian team that made sure it'd be another 0-0. It was Sweden. Now, obviously, we'd had a bad record against Sweden, but, it wasn't one of the great powerhouses of world football, was it? But for me, again, it's kind of like the mentality, the mental strength of the England team, and probably where Graham Taylor fell down as a novice England manager. There was too much harping back to what Sweden had done and what Sweden can do, rather than what we could do to Sweden. And there was lots of things going on behind the scenes. People who were in Sweden, who were half in the Swedish camp, half in the England camp, giving advice to Graham Taylor about how best to play and where were the weaknesses. And he had a strategy to exploit those weaknesses. But as we all know, some guy, chubby little striker, manages to score a goal, and out we go.
You mentioned there something interesting, because Graham Taylor was criticised, I think it was after the game, for making mention of how the Swedish players looked bigger, they were fitter, they were stronger. 4 years later, in a Champions League game, Alex Ferguson made the same reference to the Juventus players. Was this the point where we were realising that the Heysel ban, the gap between English clubs and the rest of Europe had narrowed, and that fitness, strength, we'd now been surpassed, and this is where we were really finding out what level football was at now, what it required from its players in terms of diet, fitness?
Yeah, well, I think Graham Taylor was on top of that in the sense that he was aware it was happening. It wasn't actually at that point where you could have done much about it. I remember one famous press conference we all gathered, and it was in this hall that the FA had set up, and it was almost like the Houses of Commons. So you could go down one side and the opposition went down the other side. And Graham Taylor sat down like the speaker on this great big chair in the middle of this hall. So we all went down the sides and he was in the middle. And we were just waiting for him, and everyone was laughing, saying, "Well, it's like the House of Commons," or And when he came in, we all got the white handkerchiefs out and waved all the white handkerchiefs at him. And I think that wound him up a bit. He then came out with his famous line about how Gazza was refuelling. Now, to hand it to Graham Taylor, he was slightly ahead of his time. His father was in journalism. He hired his own PR. So he had his personal PR, not just the growing PR within the FA. It was still quite small then, but there was a growing PR. He wanted his own PR and to give him advice about how to handle the media. And it kind of like worked. He would come and see three or four of us, senior football writers. And basically the guy would say to us, "Well, what are you trying to achieve today? We know you're looking for a headline. So rather than try and trip the England manager up, as we always do, like a few soft questions to start with, and then we hammer him with the same question from all directions till he gives us the headline we're looking for. So what headline are you looking for?" We'd say, "Look, this is what we want." So he'd go back and brief the England manager, and he was aware not to trip himself up. So when those questions came in, he had the right answers, and we were happy with the answers and went off, and it made life a lot simpler. Generally speaking, the Football Association, the setup of the England team was still very much way behind the rest of Europe and the rest of the world.
Going back to the strain that the relationship between manager and captain was under, this is the game, Sweden, where Taylor famously takes Lineker off 30 minutes from time. Just after the France game, Taylor had made a very cryptic remark concerning Lineker. He contributed exactly as I thought he would. These days, a comment like that would be everywhere. I'm trying to think of a relationship between manager and captain at that level that seemed to be as troubled as this one was towards the end. And after the Brazil friendly, where Lineker had missed that penalty, Taylor was quoted as saying, you could argue that we played Brazil with 10 men. And it's not necessarily specific to Lineker, though it was thought it was relating to Lineker. So just reading those, and based on what you've said about Taylor, really wanted to bring Shearer through, it does kind of tally up. He's gone into this tournament with his greatest striker, but someone he feels, maybe shouldn't have been there.
I'm afraid he couldn't resist those digs. Because, with that half a yard of speed gone, Gary Lineker had become the player everyone criticised him in the first place, which is a bit unfair. He'd been a bit of a goal hanger. But, he had incredible speed and he was a formidable striker. But without that half yard of speed, he became less effective for the team. Not that he was very effective for the team at his peak, really, but because, he played for himself to score goals. That's why he scored so many. And Taylor's work ethic and team structure was that he wanted a united team. That's why when you talk about some of the players he might have left out, he was looking for a team rather than a group of individuals that never ever fitted together. So for me, it all harps back to the turn of the year. I think it was a French friendly at the turn of the year, that he should have actually made up his mind and brought Shearer in and stuck with him. But there would have been such an outcry. He knew there'd been an outcry that it would have been hard to handle that outcry. And the whole rest of the build-up to the tournament would have been, why did you leave out Lineker? And would Lineker have even gone to the tournament if he'd have been on the bench? So, yeah, it was sad to see Gary Lineker ending his international career the way he did, being, hooked 10 minutes before the end, but he wasn't contributing to the game, didn't look as though he was going to score, but he wasn't getting any service. And that's the problem. It was inevitable. It was going to end in tears for Taylor.
I know that Italia 90, that team had to be broken up partly through the retirement of the likes of Shilton, Robson and Butcher. There was still, as I said earlier, Waddle and Beardsley knocking around. Barnes and Gascoigne were injured. I remember a European Championship qualifier in 91. England beat Turkey 1-0, but the side was so different from Italia 90. And I couldn't get my head around how the team had changed so much in less than a year. Was Taylor right to break up that side, to move on from Italia 90 and go off in a different direction? Did he need to do that?
I don't think he had any choice. He's talking about all the injuries, what happened to Gascoigne. It kind of like evolves in an England team. There's always far too many injuries, Southgate's team now that bears very little resemblance to the World Cup team that did so well. Because you've got lots of good young players have come through, and the team is different. For me, I think it's arguably slightly better. I think they've got some really good young players.
Was the Euro 92 exit the point at which Taylor should have gone, or like Bobby Robson, did he deserve a shot at redemption? Bobby Robson's disastrous Euro 88, Italia 90, a hero.
Well,
did Taylor deserve that?
Probably not, but he hadn't been around that long. And again, I don't think there was, a massive queue of candidates. We hadn't really got into the era of getting all the foreign coaches in yet. So I think, but also immediately after the Euros, you're all straight into a World Cup qualifying group. And there's not a lot of time to change. So I think, give him a chance to qualify. Was that a right decision? Obviously, in retrospect, no, it wasn't. Complete disaster. And we didn't go to the World Cup. It was a bit of a break for us covering international World Cup football, because we were still at the height of the hooligan problem. Fans, were such a massive distraction and such a difficult situation to control. Well, in fact, you couldn't control it. So that was the World Cup, my only World Cup, in fact, without an England team. It was quite refreshing, to go and watch loads of different teams play and travel around, no trouble, and watch some quality football.
Finally, the Sun had turned Taylor's head into a turnip as part of its headline after the Sweden-England game, and Taylor was vilified for substituting Lineker in that final game. Was Taylor ever able to live that down? I know he's still England manager for another 18 months, but that must have made his job incredibly difficult.
Well, that's why it was the impossible job, because it made it impossible. Not the fact that it was impossible to manage the England team. I don't think that was impossible. But you had all those ingredients and all those problems we've been discussing about lack of preparation, lack of time, the fact the Premier League couldn't care about the England team. It all builds up against it. But this was personal. And it was the first time in his life he'd ever suffered like that. Or previously, it was just like how great this guy is, taking little old Watford from the 4th division to runners-up in the old 1st division. What a phenomenal achievement that is. He just had so much praise heaped on him, and he had an owner in Elton John that loved him, and English football admired him, admired what Watford was doing, and playing in such a progressive way. It wasn't just all long-ball football. They had 2 gifted wingers. So, no, I think it was hard for him to take on a personal level. And because the abuse that he was taking was relatively new. Bobby Robson suffered quite a bit, but nowhere near as personal as Taylor.
Thank you for your time, Harry. Tell our listeners what you're up to these days, where they can find your work. I know you've written tons and tons of books. What's the best way for people to find your work, and whether you're on any social media that you want to share with us?
I'm on Football Legends 100, F Legends 100. That's on Twitter. And then you'll find all details about my book. Brought one out last week. Chelsea winning the Champions League, how they did it in 2012 and how they did it in 2021. That's now #1 bestseller in a matter of a couple of days. Got one about how Leicester won the FA Cup. That's out now, and they're all available on Amazon.
Thank you to Harry Harris. Links to Harry's work will be up in the show notes along with Euro 92 links. Please do rate, review and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts. If you're an Apple user, that does remain the easiest way for the show to grow. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to listener Richard Mancini. Appreciate the email, Richard. Good to know that people are enjoying the podcast. I suspect if Richard had hung on to the pair of 1991 FA Cup final Spurs Umbro shorts he once had, with what they might have fetched on eBay these days, he could have ended up owning some yacht and listening to this show while sunning himself. The yacht moors somewhere off Monte Carlo, I don't know, just riffing here. The podcast can be followed on both Twitter and Instagram at Shorts Were Short and Facebook.com/Shorts Were Short. If you want to join the group page, please do. If you want to drop the show an email, you can get me shortswereshort@1607westegg.com. All my work is at danielruiztyson.com. Thank you for your time. The artwork is by Tom Hadfield. The music is 80s synth pop by Toto Cyberspace. I've been Daniel Ruiz Tyson. This has been When Shorts Were Short. If the shorts weren't short, we don't talk about it.